Hi everyone, this is Robert and welcome to Deep Geek Live. Apologies for being a couple of minutes late starting up. I had a few issues with my setup, which is why I'm also a little bit fuzzy around the edges today. Hopefully that doesn't interrupt the stream in any way, but I'll get it sorted out for next time. Anyway, today we are talking about Fire and Blood Part 2, or Blood and Fire. I'll get to that in just one moment. This is the follow-up to the 2018 book that George R. R. Martin wrote called Fire and Blood, which is a history of the Targaryens, the Targaryen family, and the Targaryen reign and rule in Westeros. I do try to do a very brief overview of what's happening in the wider world before we get into it. Not too much to talk about this week. Do want to mention Westworld. Westworld Season 4 kicked off just a few days ago on Sunday night. Season 4, Episode 1. I thought it was great. I really enjoyed it. It's quite it feels a bit like a reset, to be honest. If you have got slightly overwhelmed by the convoluted plot lines that there have been in the last couple of seasons of Westworld, they've really stripped it down for this. It may well ramp up in the future, but it's quite a slow start, just bringing us back in. And I thought it looked fantastic. The acting, the music always is fantastic for Westworld. So that's what we've got going on. I did have a question from one of my patrons asking, this was Heike Durr saying, are you doing any Westworld this season? The answer is no. I mean, I'm not saying no, definitely no. I may do a video or something like that, but the plan is not to this time around. Instead, what I want to do is recommend a couple of people I've collaborated with a lot on Westworld in the past. First of all, if you want excellent breakdown videos, I can think of nobody better than Hacks Dogma. Please do go and check out that channel. If you're wanting post show chat and analysis and engagement, please check out Justin on Top Shelf Fandom. I'm sure if you're watching live, then the moderators will be putting a link in the chat wherever that is. Okay, let's and the other thing to say is there's lots on Lord of the Rings on Prime. The Rings of Power, there's lots of content coming out now from them. We're getting interviews, pictures, new sort of mini trailers on a daily basis. Expect this for the next couple of months. This is exactly what they did with the Wheel of Time. I'm not going to go through in detail every single thing that they've done, but do, if you want to keep an eye on it, then follow me on Twitter. That's probably the best way of keeping up on it. Okay, so let's get into Fire and Blood, and just so we all know what we're talking about here, I'll do a sort of an overview of where we're at and what therefore we might be expecting. I will frame this as I always do around questions from my patrons, and I'll pick up as many questions as I can from the chat. Fire and Blood has been a project that George R. R. Martin has sort of thought about and played around with the idea for a long time now. He announced that he was going to, this was a long time ago, he announced he was wanting to write this as a history of the Targaryen reign and rule in Westeros, but he was wanting to do it after he'd finished writing A Song of Ice and Fire. Along came The World of Ice and Fire, which, for those who haven't read it, is it's a sort of a world book, really. It's part history, part explanations of different parts of the world, so descriptions of parts of Essos as well as Westeros. That had a long history of the reign of the Targaryens. Fire and Blood Part 1, when he finally came to write it, well, actually, I should rewind a moment. The World of Ice and Fire was co-written. He had a couple of collaborators there, Elio Garcia and Linda. I've forgotten her surname now. Anyway, they pardon me, they co-wrote it with him. And the conceit there was that this was an in-world history, which was, so we're seeing a Maester's history world book, The World of Ice and Fire. When that was published a while ago, at some point while struggling on writing The Winds of Winter, George R. R. Martin, clearly his mind started turning to other things that he could write to keep his creative juices going. And Fire and Blood was where he poured his energy. He had a head start with this, of course, because a lot of this had already been written for the World of Ice and Fire, and also, pardon me, sorry, I've got a little bit of a cough today. I do apologise. And also he had a couple of novellas, really, that have fallen. Antonsen, Andrew Kay, thank you very much. Linda Antonsen was the other collaborator. He also had a couple of novellas which have formed a lot of the basis of the Dance of the Dragons, or the build up to the Dance of the Dragons narrative. So it was relatively easy for him to take what he'd already written and expand it out. And this was his own work. There were no collaborators on this one, but he soon found that this was quite what he wanted to write was quite a large book. So he decided he was going to break this down into two, and what we got was Fire and Blood Part 1, which was the story from Aegon's invasion all the way up to the end of the regency of Aegon III. So the highlights there, I'm sure many of you have read it, but we get the invasion itself, we get the long reign of Jaehaerys I, we get the Dance of the Dragons, and then we get the regency. So that is where we ended up, and the Archmaester Gildain was the person who was in world writing this. We've had a few updates since then. We know that he's obviously in his mind that somewhere in his list of things to do was Fire and Blood Part 2. He gave an update about 3 years ago where he gave a list of what his priorities were in order, and he was very clear that he wanted to finish writing The Winds of Winter first, then maybe A Dunk and Egg, then he wanted to do A Dream of Spring, then Fire and Blood Part 2. And I and many other people thought, okay, well, probably we're not going to see it because this is a long way away. But then, of course, famously, in his update at the sort of the turn of this last year, he basically said, you know what, now everything's a priority. All of these different things I've got, the Song of Ice and Fire, Dunk and Egg, the TV shows, Fire and Blood, all of this is a priority for me. And I am progressing all of it. So suddenly we get this possibility that we're going to have Fire and Blood Part 2 earlier than we thought, particularly because, in my view, this does seem to be the thing that he goes to when he's struggling a bit. He finds it easier to write this than he does A Song of Ice and Fire. The reason, hang on, my just realised my what part of the reason for where my fuzzy oh, that's even worse. I do apologize. Let's go back to that one there. So I'm a bit fuzzy today. I will get the setup right next time. I apologize. Anyway, so my feeling is that he finds this easier to write than A Song of Ice and Fire, and the reason I think is relatively straightforward. In the A Song of Ice and Fire, this is his magnum opus, and everything he writes there has got layers. He's got so many characters. He's got so many layers of foreshadowing he has to work through. He has symbolism, and he has to tie a huge amount of things together. This is actually a very complicated book to write. Now, obviously, this is the thing that he started on, and so he's only got himself to blame in a way. But Fire and Blood is easier. He can write this relatively quickly. There's no the links across to A Song of Ice and Fire, which we will talk about in a bit, are there, but they're not as strong. He doesn't have to worry about it, all of the detail, quite so much. He can just enjoy the freedom of writing. So that's my theory, is that this is the easy thing for him to be doing. And Fire and Blood Part 1 was published in 2018. We did have an update. This was only a few months ago, when he did a big update on all the different things that he's doing. And he said, I also need to deliver the second volume of Archmaester Gildane's history, Fire and Blood, thinking of calling that one Blood and Fire rather than just Fire and Blood Volume 2. Got a couple of 100 pages of that one written, but there's still a long way to go. So this is where we're at. He has got some part of the way through on this. He has got to 200 pages in. The last one was 700 and something pages. So maybe he's somewhere around a quarter if it's going to be around the same length. I think there's a fair chance we will get this, if not before the Winds of Winter, then certainly before A Dream of Spring. So I feel this has come forward a little bit now in the pecking order, if only because he finds it slightly easier to write than A Song of Ice and Fire. So that's where we're going. In terms of the scope of this, Mike McFly said, do you think the same Maester will have written this as well? That's Archmaester Gildane. George R. R. Martin basically confirmed it there in that update I just read out, but it's this is actually something that he's retroactively changed back in the text in order to make sure that this happens. So he initially had Archmaester Gildane as being the last Maester at Summerhall, and then he wanted to be having him writing some stuff and living through to Robert's Rebellion, and so he changed it. So he wasn't there at Summerhall after all. So because he's changed it now, he's kind of bought into this character and this voice. So we will get, and this is the crucial thing here, is this is going to be in the same style. It's the way that Fire and Blood Part 1 is written is very much as an in-world narrative history, which is built on various sources. So in the same way as we had Fire and Blood Part 1, you would have a bit of history, and this source says this happens, and this source says this happens. That style is going to carry on into Fire and Blood Part 2. So the same in-world writer means, I think, the same in-world style. Sam Day saying, in Part 1, we got Aegon's conquest, the reign of Jaehaerys, the Dance of the Dragons. What are the big events and characters we will see? So the scope of this is basically everything from where Fire and Blood Part 1 finished all the way up to the end of the reign of the Targaryens. So Robert's Rebellion, the death of Aerys II. So that is the scope of what we've got. And the big things that we will get there, the first of all is the death of the dragons, basically. This is the big thing we've got going on, which will happen in the reign of Aegon III. Then we've got things like the conquest of Dawn coming into the Seven Kingdoms. We've got Aegon IV, and who had a very interesting reign, and the Great Bastards, so his bastard children, which includes some of the most important and fascinating characters that we have: Bloodraven, Shearer Seastar, Bittersteel, Daemon Blackfire, all of them, which leads into the Blackfire rebellions. We've got at the end of, towards the end of that, we then get Duncan Egg coming into the picture, the tragedy of Summerhall, and then Robert's Rebellion. There is a lot there, it has to be said. Particularly, I think, when you compare it to what was in Fire and Blood Part 1. Now, Mara Lee, hi there, Mara, saying, do you think we will only get 2 parts and that the second part will end with the reign of the Mad King? So my answer to this is that's certainly what George R. R. Martin has consistently said. This is only going to be 2 parts. We've got Fire and Blood, and then we're going to have Blood and Fire. So that kind of makes sense. However, he does obviously have a track record of sometimes expanding out what he was originally going to write, thinking he might just be writing a trilogy, ending up writing at least 7 parts, 7 books. So it would not surprise me if, having got into this, he reaches a point where he thinks, maybe I should make this 3 volumes. That would not surprise me hugely. There is a natural break there, which is what was known as the Great Spring Sickness. Now, the Great Spring Sickness happened around the year 209, 210 AC. So that still gives us nearly 100-year chunk after the Dance of the Dragons. And at that point, the king dies, Diron II, plus the king's 2 heirs die, the Hand of the King, the High Septon, lots of people, basically a huge part of a generation all die in the Great Spring Sickness. This is referenced in Dunk and Egg, incidentally, in the Sworn Sword. They're in Dawn. Dawn was unaffected by this. This is how they survived it. But lots of people died. And so that would provide a point at which you could stop this if you wished to have this in 3 parts, which for George R. R. Martin does give the added attraction of being able to hold off on having to make big decisions about what to reveal about things that will have an impact on A Song of Ice and Fire. So, for example, obviously, the tragedy at Summerhall. He doesn't have to get into that, work out how he's going to deal with that, because and Dunk and Egg will be leading up to it. That's the last bit of the last book of Dunk and Egg, will be the tragedy of the Summerhall. Does he really want to spoil that with Fire and Blood? Probably not. What about the events in leading up to Robert's Rebellion? Does he want to reveal more there? Perhaps not. So it's probably easier for him to do a cut-off there if he wants to, rather than just power on through. As always with these kinds of things, with a history book, including an in-world faux history book, then you can put it at whatever level you want to. He could write this history in 100 pages if he wanted to. It would be quite a curtailed history, or he could write it to 700 pages. He could write it in 2,000 pages. But the feeling is that he's got a lot in there that he wants to get out. Aegon IV, he has said, just in an offhand way, that so much happened that he could write a novel about Aegon IV. So he thinks that there's a lot of information. Does he want to keep that all inside? He doesn't seem like that kind of writer to me. So that's a sort of the overall scope of what we've got going on. I think he's stuck to saying this is going to be 2 parts. We're 200 pages in at the moment, expected at some point. I don't think it's going to be the next thing we see. I think that will be the Winds of Winter still, or maybe a Dunk and Egg. But I think it's not going to be in the very, very distant future. J. Martinez saying, what can we learn about Bloodraven? I hope we get a full chapter on him. I have a feeling that, and probably from now on, although I've given you my theory about this maybe being 3 parts, I will work on the assumption that what George R. R. Martin says is right, and it's going to be 2 parts. What can we learn about Bloodraven? Will he get a whole chapter? I have a feeling that the character of Bloodraven, pardon me, the character of Bloodraven will cover several chapters in this book. We will have something about the Great Bastards and the Blackfire Rebellions. His role will be running all the way through that and up to the coming to power of Aegon V, at which point probably he's going to he might reference him a few times. He'll probably mention the fact that he disappeared, but he's not going to be a main character. So the way the Fire and Blood Part 1 was written was not a chapter focused in on a person so much as here's a bit of history. It's longitudinal rather than latitudinal, if that makes sense. But we will learn a lot, and we will learn most about his interrelations with other people, how he interacted with his siblings. That is going to be the most fascinating thing, I think, about what we learn about Bloodraven. Let's go to, I think I had another question. George R.R. Tolkien saying, salutations, Robert. Salutations to you. I was just wondering if you think we will finally get some more info on the tourney at Harrenhal. Please keep up the amazing work. Well, thank you very much. And also just agree with saying, don't sweat it, it ain't that bad. I assume you're talking about the fuzziness. I won't sweat it. Thank you very much. I'm glittering, and Reflective Rambling saying I'm glittering. Wow, that's very kind. The George R. Tolkien talking about that tourney at Harrenhal. I have got a question on the tourney at Harrenhal, so I'll probably talk about this a little bit more then. But will we learn more there? I have a feeling if this gets published before Dunk and Egg gets finished, I have a feeling no. And that's for in-world reasons. That the World of Ice and Fire is written as a history written by the Maesters, effectively with bits by Gildane. And the bits by Gildane, incidentally, if you're reading through that, they're the bits that George R.R. Martin wrote. That's his voice. The bits written by the other Maester, whose name I forget for a moment, those are by his collaborators. Yes, he went through and edited it all, so he's got the sort of the overview of it, but that was where the sort of the main breakdown was. Now, what happened in there was infuriating for those of us who wanted to know about the tragedy at Summerhall. What he did was explained a little bit about the build-up and then said there was this huge fire, but what happened? Well, anyone who survived it is too traumatized to say anything. All we have is this scrap of paper that we've got, which unfortunately some ink got spilt on it, and so we can't read all the words, and so we just get a few fragments of a sentence, and we can kind of pick up the outline of what happened. It was deliberate by George R.R. Martin. He knew that he was doing this. It was so, I mean, dare I say it, heavy-handed that it was him just giving us a nod through the fourth wall to say, I know that, yeah, I know you want to know, and I'm deliberately not telling you. So that's what happened in the World of Ice and Fire. When we come to Fire and Blood Part 2, when we come to Summerhall, I kind of get the feeling he may come up with some other way of doing this. He may go back down that route again. Who knows? But I think that he doesn't want to reveal this until he gets there in Dunk and Egg. So if he writes all of the Dunk and Egg first, then perhaps we'll get a bit more in this. But if he doesn't, I think that he will be similarly vague about it. And you can be, without it being too frustrating and annoying, you can stick by this line that anyone who was there was too traumatized to say anything. But the important point is that these people died and these people survived. And that's how the history book can carry on. And that is very much in Gildane's style as a writer. Roman Lakovets saying, I might be mistaken, but didn't George R.R. Martin say that Mushroom's accounts are quite reliable because people at court thought he was a simpleton and weren't afraid to talk about their secrets in front of him? Well, so Mushroom is one of the sources which Gildane uses in Fire and Blood Part 1. And I talked, when I was talking through Fire and Blood a few weeks ago, I was asked, how reliable do you think he is compared to, say, Septon Eustace or someone like that? And I went through a few examples and I concluded that sometimes Mushroom was reliable, sometimes he wasn't. What George R.R. Martin has said, as far as I'm aware, is that, yes, there were some bits sometimes when he did get bits of information that others didn't. So there are some times where he has got the truth of it and others haven't. However, that doesn't mean he's always truthful, that he is writing a bawdy account of what happened at the time. And some of it is clearly exaggerated, some of it's clearly made up, but he does seem to get to, particularly when there is something salacious going on that the Septons and the Maesters don't really want to talk about. He's the one who seems to understand what was actually happening. So yes, that is because of the fact that people underestimated him. Now, Mara Lee, I think it was, who was asking about this as well. So Mara Lee saying, will Mushroom be a character in part 2? Now, on this, I'm afraid we do have a little bit of bad news, because although he does survive, he probably won't play a big role in this. Now, let's see whether I can try. I've just got this open in front of me here, and unfortunately I can't find the exact quote I was going for, but basically George R. R. Martin does specifically say through the voice of Gildane that whereas Mushroom did survive, then he won't be oh, here we go. The dwarf would come, and this is about 2 pages from the end of the book, so it's almost like a wrapping up. The dwarf would come to outlive the young king that he abandoned, because he goes off with Torren Manderley at the end of this. The later volumes of his testimony, filled with colourful accounts of his life in White Harbour, his sojourn at the court of the Sea Lord of Braavos, his voyage to the port of Ibn, and his years amongst the mummers of the lisping lady, are valuable in their own right, though less useful to our purpose here. So sadly, the little man with the foul tongue must pass from our story. Though never the most reliable, pardon me, though never the most reliable of chroniclers, the dwarf spoke truths no one else dared to speak, and was often droll besides. So basically he's saying that he must now pass from our story, which is George R. R. Martin's way, obviously, of saying, well, that's it for Mushroom. So don't be surprised if we get a couple of mentions of Mushroom as a source, but he stays up for a while with Torren Manderley. It will just be a matter of what impact Torren Manderley has on this. And what impact will Torren Manderley have on this? Well, that's an interesting one, because where we leave this story is with Aegon III having reached maturity, and he walks into, this is the last scene of the book, basically. He walks into where his regents and his small council are, and Torren Manderley had been his hand and basically had been running the kingdom and ready for him when he reached his maturity. And he walks in on his birthday and says, Lord Manderley, how old am I? And Torren Manderley says, you're 16 years old, you've reached your maturity. And then he says, that's right. And so that makes me king. And Torren Manderley says, yes, it does. And then Aegon III says, right, get out of my chair. And I don't need you as my hand of the king anymore. Forget all those plans you had about a royal procession. Forget all those plans about this, that, and the other. I'm in charge now. I'm starting again from scratch. And Torren Manderley, we're told, basically just stood up, threw down his hand of the king, like Ned Stark, like abandoning his post. He just said, okay, that's it, I'm gone then. And he turned, Aegon III turned one of his most loyal supporters, we told, into an enemy. So Torren Manderley heads back up north to White Harbour. There will definitely be some kind of implication of that. There will be some extra bit of story, but it's not going to be huge. I think we can probably say that for the simple reason that he's not mentioned again in the histories that we've had so far. There are quite a lot of, I'll probably try and get into this a bit later, but there are quite a lot of loose threads that George R. R. Martin left at the end of Fire and Blood Part 1 that will almost certainly be picked up on in Fire and Blood Part 2. And Torren Manderley is one of them. He's deliberately left it there. He's now an enemy. What's he going to do? He's probably not going to succeed in it, but to bring this back to where we started, we will probably find out about what he was going to do from Mushroom. But that's it. I'm afraid that's the end of Mushroom. He won't have much of a role as a source for the Fire and Blood Part 2. Cloaked One picking up for Mike Reed, saying long-time watcher, first-time asker. Hi, Mike. Great to have your question. Do you think we will get a fuller story of Summerhall, or will George R. R. Martin save this for Dunk and Egg? So I think I answered that one just a moment ago. Apologies. So hopefully that's kind of wrapped up in what I was saying just a moment ago. By way of summary, I think it will depend on whether he's written the Dunk and Egg stories by that point. If he has, then maybe we'll get a fuller account here. If he hasn't, I think he does want to hold it off for Dunk and Egg. Sander Becker saying how funny it would be if he released Fire and Blood Part 2 before Winds of Winter. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't put it past him. He could do that. But, I mean, I hope we'll get the Winds of Winter first, but I'll take whatever I get, to be honest. But, yeah, he certainly seems to enjoy writing it. Let's go to a question from Reuven Devender saying, hey, Robert, first question as a patron. Welcome. How big of a role do you think Sandok the Shadow will play? He was one of the most interesting characters in the first book and could still play a big role in the first few chapters of the new part. So Sandok the Shadow, for those who don't know, he appeared towards the end of Fire and Blood Part 1. He is a soldier. He's a pit fighter, nearly 7 feet tall, dark-skinned but hugely scarred, mute. No, he hasn't. His tongue had been cut out, and so he often, and he's quite disfigured. He often would wear a black veil over his face, and so he got called Sandok the Shadow. And he does a few. Well, he comes across with Lara of Lys, who is Viserys's wife. And there is, I won't go into the details of it, there's this period where Lys and the House Rogaire become hugely powerful. It becomes known as the Lysine Spring. Their power fades rather dramatically, but Sandok the Shadow stays on the scene. Lara of Lys stays on the scene as well. He is there basically being the main Kingsguard to Aegon III. Very mysterious because we never hear him speak. It is apparently very hard to communicate with him because he also doesn't read or write. But he is, it would appear, hugely loyal to Aegon III and Viserys and Lara. So he basically is the person who at one point literally saves their reign. When you get this showdown, a siege within the castle for the royal family are besieged within Maegor's holdfast, and he's the person who holds off the attackers pretty much single-handedly. So he's an amazing character. What role might we see? We don't know much more about him from what we've read so far, but I imagine that he will play the same role going forward. He is going to be the Aegon III is not a great fighter. He's not a very martial figure at all. So he needs protection. The realm is quite a broken one at that time, and him having a member of the Kingsguard who is fiercely loyal and a hugely powerful fighter is going to be very important. So I don't think he's going to be doing anything in and of his own volition, but as a bodyguard, he will be hugely important. Question from Mike McFly. Do you think in Fire and Blood Part 2 we might find out if you were right with how you think the Maesters finished off the dragons? Or is that one of those things we will just chalk up to George R. R. Martin keeping things a mystery? Well, this is interesting. So the dragons die in the first few years of Aegon III's reign. Now, to start with, he doesn't care about dragons. In fact, he hates dragons. He's got quite a bad history with dragons, to be fair. So it's quite understandable. But then we read that later on in his reign, he comes back around to the conclusion that actually they're quite useful for the Targaryens. The Targaryens having dragons is a good thing. So he then tries to hatch some dragon eggs to no avail. And eventually, including getting priests from coming over from Essos, trying lots of different things. But it doesn't work. And eventually the last dragon dies during his reign. So what kills them? My theory is that this was the Maesters. It's not... we know that the Maesters, instinctively, they don't like magic. They won't like magical beasts. They don't like things breaking the status quo. They would want to get rid of the dragons, in theory, at very least. The opportunity was there for the first and only time after the Dance of the Dragons, because most of the dragons were dead. There were a few feral dragons still hanging around, and there was one live, grown-ish dragon. And that was it. So this was their one opportunity. So, and what you'll find is that from that moment onwards, the dragons, when they hatched, either they were sort of dead already, or they were small and didn't live very long at all. Small and malformed, we're told. All of which feels like the eggs were poisoned in some way. And the man who could have done this is Grand Maester Monken. Grand Maester Monken is one of the shadiest characters you're ever likely to find, simply because you have to read it twice to see quite how many different fingers point towards him. He had, for a period of time, 6 months to a year, Grand Maester Monken was during the Regency, the most powerful ruler that the country had ever had. And I mean that quite literally, because he was the regent. So he was effectively the king. The king himself was not only a child, but was hugely affected by everything that had been happening, and was most of the time just staying in his room, was not involving himself in anything. So as regent, Monken was the king. Monken was also the hand to the king. There was no small council at all. So he was the one person who did everything. He controlled absolutely everything, as well as being in charge of the Maesters, which means that he's in charge of the information passing and gathering network across Westeros. He could do absolutely anything. And then when we get Gildane asking about that period, what happened with Monken during that period, we just get this throwaway line, Monken doesn't want to talk about it. And it's like, okay, so whatever you were up to during that time when you had complete power, absolute power, you're not going to tell anyone. But immediately after that, the dragons stopped being born. So it's all very suspicious. They had the motivation, they had the means, and they had the opportunity, which makes it very suspicious. Will we, to answer the question, will we find out about this in part 2? My instinct is no. My instinct is that whatever happened had already happened. It was happening during the Regency, during that 6 month to a year period when Monken was in charge. That was when things happened. It's just that we only see the results of it a bit later when the dragons start being born malformed. So I don't think we will. What we will see are the results of the fact that there are no dragons, which gets increasingly panicky Targaryens thinking, hang on a moment, if we don't have dragons, what sets us apart from everyone else? We need to get dragons somehow. And that carries on all the way through. The amount of Targaryens who go a little bit crazy because they want dragons. They're trying to hatch dragon eggs. This is all stemming from this moment. Let's go into have a quick look in the chat. Andrew Kay saying so much was going on just in Aegon IV's reign that alone could take up a massive chunk in the book. Yes. Matthew Stewart saying, will we find any redeeming qualities in Aegon IV? I wonder. I'm suspecting not in his later reign. We have basically been told that he was a very charismatic man, and in his younger days, yeah, maybe he was quite a good guy, but the older he got, the worse he got as a human being as well as a ruler, it would appear. Reflective Rambling saying, welcome to first-time watchers, Nibirius XBL, Agatha Henney, Mike Reed, and the rare sight of Nick Butcher and Emma Scheiman, and the return of our favourite mod, Chrissy. Oh, Chrissy, welcome. Great to see you there. Chrissy, the fastest mod in the West. That's, I think we caught up in the chat. Let's go back to another question from my patrons. And we're sort of moving on now from sort of the early years towards the sort of the meat of the book, which is probably going to be around Aegon IV and the Great Bastards. So Johnny Targ says, hello, Robert. Do you think in Fire and Blood Part 2, we will finally hear spoken words from Bittersteel? George R. R. Martin has done an amazing job at creating so much intrigue on a character without ever having him say any words in lore or history. I'm going to be intrigued in Part 2 about the relationship between Bittersteel, Daemon Blackfire, and Bloodraven. Absolutely. So, Bittersteel is another one of these great bastards. He is the driving force behind the Blackfire rebellions. Yes, this was Daemon Blackfire who was the figurehead of this, but it becomes very apparent that the person pushing him to that was Bittersteel, Aegor Rivers. Now, as you say there, Johnny, we don't actually get any, and this is true for a lot of characters around this time, we don't get any dialogue from him. Certainly not in The World of Ice and Fire, and we haven't come up to him in Fire and Blood. The same, I think, can probably be said for people like Shira Seastar, which would be absolutely fascinating. And Daemon Blackfire, I think we may get a sentence, but not much at all. Really, it's only Bloodraven that we hear from in person through Dunk and Egg. Now, will we get more about Aegor Rivers? Absolutely, because Aegor Rivers is the person, he's having sparked this by getting Daemon Blackfire to be declaring himself king. He's the person, he's there who rescues the sword Blackfire, takes it back to Essos. The second Blackfire rebellion, the one that we read about in Dunk and Egg, the Mystery Knight, that one, the big talking point there was, why wasn't Aegor Rivers here? That's how important he was, that his absence was noteworthy. The fact that he wasn't there was the thing that Bloodraven was fascinated by. There's also the third Blackfire Rebellion, and he founded the Golden Company to effectively be the continuity Blackfire Rebellion. He was their first leader, so what he says, what his actions have had impacts across the Blackfires themselves, but then also in the Golden Company, and that will play into A Song of Ice and Fire, obviously, because the Golden Company are starting to make an appearance now with Aegon VI's invasion. So, will we find out more about him? Absolutely. I have a feeling once we get into this Great Bastards kind of world, George R. R. Martin will write a huge amount about it, because those interrelations are fascinating. They're really, really interesting. How they all work, who loves who hates who is slightly ambivalent. That the relations between those four characters are what shaped what happened the Targaryen reign from then on, effectively. So I'm fully expecting us to see more of him, but this is the point at which I'm thinking maybe George R. R. Martin will write up to there and then go, you know what, I've now got however many 100 pages in, maybe we should take a little break because this is going to get too big. Cloaked One, picking up for Nick Butcher. Thank you very much. I love it when people do this, picking up questions for other people. It's very kind. This live is keeping me entertained while I'm on bed rest. Do you think we will be seeing any Starks play major roles in Fire and Blood Part 2? Well, I don't know why you're on bed rest, but if you're unwell, I hope you're better soon. Do you think we will see any Starks play major roles in Fire and Blood Part 2? Well, for the most part, no. We certainly will at the end, when we get Robert's Rebellion and obviously Ned Stark there, and the build up to that, the Starks will play a role. But for the most part, in the period in between, the Starks largely stay quiet, which is part of the reason why actually there's a few gaps in our knowledge of the names of the Starks. When you go back 2-3 generations from Ned Stark, you actually start not knowing all the names of the rulers. So that's because they weren't really up to huge amounts. So at the end, yes, are they involved in things like the Blackfire Rebellion? Well, a bit, but not hugely. For example, in the second Blackfire Rebellion, it was who Bloodraven could rally an army quickly. He couldn't rally the North quickly, so the North weren't really involved in that. And frankly, the North cared a whole lot less. This is not really something that they cared about hugely. So not really. This isn't a North thing. Let's get to a question from Emma Ayman, just saying, will the end of Blood and Fire cover Daenerys and Viserys' escape to Essos? And if so, might that shed some light on the Red Door conspiracy? So, well, two bits there. Will it cover the flight to Essos? Quite possibly. I don't know where George R. R. Martin exactly will wish to end this, but it will be with the end of the Targaryen reign. Now, so that's the fall of King's Landing. What happens after that, obviously, is there's the quick besieging of Dragonstone and their escape. He might put a little footnote in there. I doubt we will get much more than and they headed off to Essos. But this in-world is very much a matter of when it's being written. And if you look at the world of Ice and Fire, this was being written during Robert Baratheon's reign, and it is dedicated to the great and glorious reign of Robert Baratheon, because in world the Maesters had to suck up to the king. And so it may well be that will be again in world where we are with Fire and Blood, in that we end with isn't Robert Baratheon a wonderful king? And they wouldn't want to say, oh, but there are a couple of Targaryens left. It would be and yes, they escaped, full stop, but Robert Baratheon's great. That's probably where they're going to go with it. What they will probably say is the same thing that we've had elsewhere, which is they went to the Braavosi coast. That's what we're told. We're not told they went to Essos. We're told that they went to the Bravosi coast. Will this end the debate about the Red Door? I don't think so. Personally, I think we're 95% certain on the house with the Red Door now. I've done a video on it. If you're interested, I won't go over it all this time, but it's in Bravos, and I think that all of the evidence is there. I think that all of the evidence against it doesn't really stack up. For example, the line about trees and things don't grow in Bravos. People often quote that to say, well, how could there be a lemon tree in Bravos? But that's because they literally cut that sentence off halfway through. The sentence ends. They don't grow in Bravos except for in the courts and gardens of the rich and powerful, seeming to suggest very clearly that in the gardens and courts of the rich and powerful, things do grow. So that's the level. I think we're 95% certain. I don't think George R. Martin feels the need to say any more on that. The reveal in Dance with Dragons of the marriage pact signed and witnessed by the Sea Lord of Bravos shows that they were there. So I don't think there's much of a mystery left to that one now. Matthew Stewart saying, will we get any reference to Aegon or Jon near the end? A possible mention of the prince's son escaping or there being a secret child? Again, I don't think we will end like that. I think we're more likely to end with, now we're on to the great and glorious reign of Robert Baratheon. No mention. It will be interesting to see how they cover the Tower of Joy bit, but probably not in great detail would be my guess. The key thing from a history of the Targaryens is, and Rhaegar was killed. And then you might, as a sort of a side note, say, and then Ned Stark went off and found that Lyanna, who ostensibly all of this was about, was found dead. That would be it. So will there be any talk of a child? No, because in a history by the Maesters, they wouldn't write that because it's not general knowledge. Although, incidentally, the Maesters probably know, or at least the Citadel machine probably knows, because let's not forget that a child was born at the Tower of Joy, and for that to happen, if Rhaegar, the Crown Prince, was having his child born that he thinks is a child of prophecy, he's going to have a Maester there. He's going to have a Maester there to make sure that the childbirth goes well. So there will have been a Maester there. Almost certainly, I think the Maester from Starfall will have been there, and almost certainly they will have survived. So I think the Maesters will be aware of this, but there's no need for them to say anything. And they don't necessarily know the bit about it being Jon. Any mention of Aegon? No, I think that the official the official line about the Viserys' children being killed will be stuck to. Peter Lewandowski saying, hello and thank you for what you're doing. You're welcome. Is there a chance that in Fire and Blood Part 2 we hear again from Maester Ayman Targaryen and further context of his decision to refuse the throne? Well, we will hear about him. We will get well, we get quite a lot of information. Instead, I was trying to remember what it was because I'm doing the audiobooks at the moment of A Song of Ice and Fire. I'm just going through a chapter by chapter quite slowly. I think it was the first Jon chapter in A Clash of Kings. We get a lot of information about who Maester Ayman is and the choices he had to make. Now, in that, it becomes very clear that he could have been king. He had that choice to be king, and he decided not to, and he decided to go to the wall because he knew that if he hung around, he would always be there as seen as a potential rival or somebody that people could gather around to support if they didn't like what Aegon V was doing. That's why he went to the wall. So I think we've been told his story, and I think although there might be other elements added into this, I think when we've not been told any big lies about this. I think this is the truth of it. So I don't think there's going to be any big new reveals. The context, for those who are wondering, was we get this great council to decide who should become king, and Ayman was the choice of a lot of people, but Ayman was a maester, and so he'd sworn off from all of these kingly things, but people still approached him and said, "Hey, we think you'd be right," and he said no, and it's only after that they went and thought, okay, well, we've got Aegon, we can try that, we can give it to Egg instead. So that's why he's Aegon the Unlikely. He was the fourth son of a fourth son, something like 16th in line to the throne when he was born. It was very unlikely that he ever inherited, but Ayman was offered it before him. Canadian Fantasy Corner, hi there, saying, any chance you might do chapter by chapter analysis live streams of Fire and Blood when we get it? Yeah, I think Mara Lee, you're also asking how I might cover this when we get it. I mean, I found it quite a hard thing to gauge. I'll say when to do this. I think I said this the same for the Winds of Winter, is with Fire and Blood Part 1 when it came out. I obviously read it straight away from beginning to end, but I realized that not everyone can, and not everyone's got the time to. So when should I be producing the stuff? Or I don't want to be doing spoilers, live streams on things when people have still not got to that part. So I'm not 100% sure how we'll cover it. What I did on Fire and Blood Part 1, which seemed to work quite well, was do videos on topics that the things which came up. And there were things like what was in that letter to Aegon from Dawn, and what on earth was going on there with Princess Aeria on Balerion, that kind of thing. So that's the approach broadly I'm probably going to take. But yeah, I think I will probably do a few live streams when it comes out. As I say, it could be years, but when it comes out, I'll definitely do some live streams covering this, whether I do it chapter by chapter or chunk by chunk, maybe. I don't know yet. Bear Island. Hello, Robert. Hope you and Dan are well. I hope we get more on Summerhall. I think we'll have to wait. But do you think there's a chance we'll get insight into the changes in Aegon V? He started out a humble, grounded, small folk beloved king who bucked the trend of marrying within his own family, only to die in a tragic and very dragony way. Yeah, this is one thing I think that we will definitely get in Fire and Blood Part 2, is we will see the details of it in Dunk and Egg. But it has to be covered to some level in Fire and Blood Part 2, because you can't, this is a huge change in character. The Egg that we meet in the 3 Dunk and Egg stories we've got is very innocent. He's very kind. Yeah, he's a child. So obviously we haven't seen the man that he's going to grow into. But he seems not very Targaryen-y. The influence of Dunk is very clear. He does seem to care a lot about people. Again, the fact that he's not expecting to rule probably plays into this. So that character gets transformed at the end to someone that we're told gets obsessed with hatching dragon eggs. Now, obsessed to the point of getting old manuscripts from over in a Shire, getting mages in, setting up this elaborate plan in Summerhall to try and hatch eggs, gathering them together. This seems to be the thing which consumed his time and energy towards the end. So where did that come from? That's, I mean, maybe George R. R. Martin will just sort of like gloss over it. Gildane says, and over time he became more obsessed with dragons, which he could do, but I think that this isn't giving away any things that will spoil us for Dunk and Egg. So I have a feeling we will get to see this, and it will be in Dunk and Egg as well. This will be our best opportunity to see this move towards I don't like using the phrase, but towards madness, which is what we see a lot in Targaryens. This is something that George R. R. Martin is definitely working on, as sort of foreshadowing for Dany, is that Dany is, and he said it, this isn't just me coming up with this, she is going down a darker path. And so lots of Targaryens do seem to do this. They start off quite good, but then they head down a worse path. The Mad King, Aerys II, started out actually seemingly quite good and wise, but clearly deteriorated quite a lot. We get someone like Aegon IV, which we'll talk about in a moment, who started out, didn't seem to be too bad when he started out, but again, he didn't go down the very dragony kind of route, but he definitely became a worse ruler the longer he was there. And you see a huge amount of these Targaryens who just become more and more obsessed, particularly with dragons. So if we have with Egg a character that we like, who goes down this path, I don't think he's going to end up in a dark, but he doesn't seem to be wanting to kill anyone. He just wants dragons. But we will see that obsession start to come out. And this is I think one of the big foreshadows from his route, from his story, over to the story of A Song of Ice and Fire, because he is a character who cares about the common people. We're told he cares about the common people in the same way that Daenerys cares about the common people. But he still becomes obsessed in a way that perhaps she's going to. We haven't seen yet what this darker path is going to mean for her, but it's fire and blood. We've been told that. Andrew Kay saying Aegon V is probably the least Targaryen of the Targaryen kings for most of his life. Humility, care for the masses, and very anti the incest. Yes, absolutely. So he does, but then he's also getting fascinated towards the end of his life with dragons. So how does this happen? Damon Blackfire saying, is anyone else in agreement that they shouldn't make a show about Dunk and Egg until there's a conclusion? Also, it would be great animated. Yeah, I'm completely in agreement on the animation. I think it would work really well as an animation, but that's not happening. So they're doing live action. At least that's the plan. None of the, other than, I have to say this all the time, other than House of the Dragon, none of these things that we've been talking about, I went through them all in the last live stream last week. None of them have been greenlit so far. We talk all about the Jon Snow show. That's not being greenlit. None of these things have been greenlit. But they must be getting close because they've been in production for a long time. George R. R. Martin is talking about third, fourth iterations of scripts. At some point, you either say, yeah, this is working, or no, it's not. But anyway, in terms of Dunk and Egg, I think we have to accept the fact that this is a show which will have time jumps in some way. The first three stories are when Egg is still a child. Dunk is basically an old teenager, still a very young man. And that is probably going to be the case for the next one, maybe two more stories. But when book 12, story 12 comes out, George R. R. Martin has said he's thinking of doing 12, they are going to be grown men. This is decades later, married with kids kind of territory. So this is, the characters will age up. So I am, provided the stories are there, and for me this is the crucial thing. I do not want them making Dunk and Egg TV show about a story that's not there yet. I think that they can make a show about those first three, and whatever 1 or 2 extra stories of them being about that age. And then once George R. R. Martin has written the next stories, we can age up the characters. A bit like with The Crown, where you had 2 seasons of here's the young Queen and Prince Philip, and then another 2 seasons of here's the middle-aged Queen, Prince Philip, and then another 2 seasons, I think another 2 seasons coming of older Queen and Prince Philip. And they've just aged up the characters. So they've got new actors each couple of seasons. So that, I think, is the way that they can go with this. My concern is that they don't go beyond what is written, more than a concern about them not starting it. If they're happy to do 3 and then stop and wait for him to write the next one and then see whether or not they need to hire new actors, I'm okay with that. Shade Corvinus saying, do you think we will get information on Robert's rebellion in Fire and Blood Part 2? Information that we don't already know. My guess is that this is one of those things that we will probably get much the same as what we had in The World of Ice and Fire. Again, this is where George R. R. Martin is going to start. He's going to take what was there in The World of Ice and Fire, cut and paste it into a new document, and then he will beef up some elements, and he will leave some as is, and he will reword some other bits. But that's going to be his starting point. Robert's Rebellion had quite a lot in there in The World of Ice and Fire, so it wouldn't surprise me if we don't get too many changes. Will we get any more information that is useful rather than just sort of like extra bits about details of Robert Baratheon's campaign across the south, which would be fascinating? Then maybe not. The kinds of things we might learn are, or at least we'll get some speculation on, are things like, and when I was talking about Robert Baratheon's going across this was told relatively swiftly. I say there was a lot of information on Robert's Rebellion. We're told relatively swiftly. Robert Baratheon, when the rebellion starts, he's in the Eyrie, he's in the Vale, and then he manages to escape out of there, takes Gulltown, and then gets on a boat, goes across the Stormlands, gathers his forces, and then heads in across the sort of westwards from where he is, and then northwards to join up with his allies, because basically his allies are all in the north and he's down in the south. Now, we get some tantalizing glimpses at what's going on. One of which is we get at Summerhall, incidentally, there are 3 battles in a day, because he learns that 3 of his bannermen are going to declare for the Targaryens, not for him, and they're going to meet up at Summerhall. So he brings his army over to Summerhall, and then he takes them on one at a time. These 3 different armies, these 3 houses, he wins each of them. We're not told who this source was. Somebody told him this. Who would have told him? That's the kind of thing where we might get some speculation. I've always wondered whether it was Varys, for example, who always seems like the kind of person who would just be hedging his bets. Yes, he's there in the court with Aerys, but if Aerys loses, he wants to make sure that he survives. Therefore, he wants to make sure that he's on the right side of Robert Baratheon. And what do you know? The Master of Whisperers for Aerys suddenly keeps his post, and Robert Baratheon keeps him there. There must be a reason for that. And then similarly, when he heads across, he meets the army from the Reach, which first of all, they have his only defeat of the war is when they come up against the vanguard of the Tyrell, the Reach army, and this is the Tarleys, House Tarley. So Randall Tarley, who is this great general, he leads them to victory, and then gets told, "You don't go chase." Mace Tyrell comes up and says, don't chase them, don't chase the army, don't force the victory. Actually, you know what we'll do? Let's go over there and besiege the Storm's End. And they bring the biggest army in all of Westeros and just basically take it away from the action. Why is that? Now, I think the implication is that some clever person there in Highgarden realized, you know what, it's probably best to steer clear of this war if we possibly can. I think we all know who the very clever person in Highgarden probably is, but we're not told any hint of that. We're just told that they made this tactical decision. We're not told why. So that's the kind of thing about Robert's Rebellion I suspect we might get a little bit of extra information on, or speculation from Gildane on. I don't think we will get any extra information about things that happened at the Tower of Joy, or what was really going on in Rhaegar and Lyanna, and what happened secretly at the tourney at Harrenhal. I think we will learn about those things through other means. Let's go to Reflective Rambling, just going, don't go chasing maesters, stick to the scepters and the guards that you're used to. I've no idea sometimes what the... I get the reference, but I've no idea what the chat is on about sometimes. Okay, let's go to a question from Gabriel Farrell saying, hi, Robert, I hope you're well. And probably, actually, I should just take a moment. Patrons, thank you. I say this every week. I mean this every week. I can't do what I do without your support. Thank you very much. This is why patrons' questions always get priority on these live streams. If you would like to support this channel, support what I do, if you'd like to get access to a few special patron bonuses, then go and check out Patreon. There's a link in the live chat, and there will be one appearing afterwards down in the description for the video. So thank you, patrons, and do go and check out Patreon if you are interested. Gabriel Farrell saying, when we get Fire and Blood 2, Electric Boogaloo, much better than Blood and Fire in my opinion. Who am I to disagree? How many more clues do you think we'll get about what happened at Summerhall? Will it all be left up to Duncan Egg, or do you think we'll learn some more? Still on this kind of Summerhall link, I think what we will get is a lot more information about the build-up to it. We will get not about what happened there, but I think we will get enough that we might start being able to get an idea of what the plan was. Because the plan for what happened at Harrenhal, we get little hints of it. He wanted to hatch some eggs. He hired in some pyromancers. He got 7 eggs there. He brought the family together. We know a few bits here, but I think what we'll probably get is a few pages of the build up to this. Maybe it's going to be just something as simple as and he read something that made him think, I know how to hatch dragon eggs. The way to do it, you need these different things here. And then he went out and he got all those things, and he this was his greatest moment, and that's why he gathered all the family there, because he wanted them to be there while dragons were being hatched. That kind of thing. I think we will get that, a bit more context around it, what the plan was going to be. What we will not get is what actually happened. Why was it that this didn't go to plan? Why was it that everything burned down? Clearly, there was some fire that went out of control, but was this an accident? Was this intent on somebody's part? To that, I don't think we will get. Just the wider context of what was supposed to happen. Reuven Devender saying, how big a role do you think Dunk will play? My guess is that George wants to keep his appearances in the book as low and vague as possible to avoid spoiling Duncan Egg, but that won't be easy. He was involved in some things that have to be mentioned, unless George once again does their ink spilled on this and it isn't readable trick. Baelor Breakspear's death, Egg squiring for him, Egg naming his son after him, him slaying Daemon the Third, him defeating the Laughing Storm, him doing something at Summerhall. There could also be a mention of Barristan defeating him and Duncan the Small in a tourney, him accompanying Bloodraven to the wall, or his involvement in the Second Blackfire Rebellion. So, yes, I think you cannot do a history of the Targaryens during this time period without mentioning Sir Duncan. Some of this will be just random mentions. So the early Duncan Egg stuff will just be sort of vaguely random mentions. Obviously, with the Baelor Breakspear thing, you have to mention him, and it will be interesting to see that from a Maester's perspective as much as anything else. But you will see that his impact there. But what he was doing down in Dawn, that probably won't really get much of a mention, other than the fact that he survived because he happened to be in Dawn. The Second Blackfire Rebellion, probably that's just a mention that he happened to be there. Because although Dunk was a catalyst for a lot, really this is Bloodraven figuring out what was. If you look at the bigger picture, this is Bloodraven figuring out what's going on, summoning an army, surrounding the area, and then just winning. So it would probably have happened pretty much the same, regardless of whether Dunk and Egg had been there. Similarly, I think that things that happen up in Winterfell, which we will probably read about in the She-Wolves of Winterfell, they probably won't get much mention. That early part of his life, until we get to the Great Council, where he gets chosen as king, probably the way that this is going to be mentioned, just dipping in every now and then and saying the person who would turn into Aegon at this point, Aegon V, at this point he was over here, at this point he was over there, because he won't have been important to the main story that they're telling at that time, which is the main story of the Targaryen reign and rule. He's actually insignificant. He's going around the highways and byways of the Seven Kingdom. So that, I think, just mentions. The later part, yes, he has to be there, and I think that it will be in the same way that, say, Kristen Cole. We will see him. We will hear maybe a few lines from him. I am absolutely fascinated by this, in as much as how he gets described, because Gildain does. As well as just sort of saying what happened, he does try to paint a picture of characters. We get a very good impression about most of the people involved in the Dance of the Dragons. Daemon Targaryen, for example, we get lots of language about what he was like as a person. Otto Hightower, we've got a very clear idea about what he was like as a person. I think we will get that from Archmaester Gildain about Dunk, which I will find fascinating, because so far we've only really heard about Dunk from Dunk's own perspective, and we can come to conclusions about what he was like as a person, but what is it that others think and see when they see him? Do they see, he sees himself as being Dunk the Lunk, thick as a castle wall. He doesn't think that he's that clever. He doesn't think that he's really doing anything particularly momentous. He just is doing what he can, the right thing at the right time. But is that how others view him? Will there be some speculation? Surely someone will start speculating on why it is that he happens to be in all of these places when significant things happen. Now, yes, we can say obviously he's in interesting places because that's the stories happen when he's there, but George R. R. Martin works as a writer on several levels, and he knows that this is a thing with Dunk, that Dunk happens to be at places when things at the Second Blackfire Rebellion, he happened to be there. That sounds very random that he happened to be there, but he is. And we get Bloodraven clearly fascinated by it. Why are you here? What's going on? I don't quite understand it. And Bloodraven, earlier on, we get Dunk, who remembers when he was just a person, a young lad down in Fleabottom, and Bloodraven was riding through, and Bloodraven turns and looks at him. This is an fantastic little, just a small snippet from the books, but it's great insight to both of those characters, is that Bloodraven comes in, rides into the city past all of these the small folk, and then just suddenly turns and stares at Dunk, who at the time is nothing, but it's almost as if he goes, there's something about that guy. I think he's going to be important. And he clearly does think he's going to be important. Is this just something that Bloodraven notices? Do other people notice it? I think we'll have to wait and see on that one. I have and some point I will do, this is on my very long list of videos. I have a very long list of videos that I'd like to make. At some point, I'd love to make a video exploring this idea that I have of him being, he's not magical, he's not prophetic, but he's a catalyst. He's the person who, where he goes, things happen. And so he is magical in a way, but in a non-magical way. I haven't worked out exactly how to frame that, but there is a video idea there, because he clearly is important. And he knows, he recognizes, why is it that, what is it about his foot that's so special that it's worth the life of a prince of the realm? I think we guess why at the end, but why is it that he happens to then end up taking the person around, saving the life many times of the person who would become Aegon V? Why is it that he happened to be there at the right place when the Second Blackfire Rebellion was just being planned and about to happen? Why is it that he is there at the heart of all of these things? Not because he's thought about it, he just happens to be there. That makes him a special character and an intriguing character, because it is not intent, because we can see into his mind and heart. He's not the person who's thinking, oh, I think I'll just go and mix with the rich and powerful and try and influence events on a world stage. He never thinks about that level of things. He thinks about, that guy's just insulting that woman, I'm going to go and step in. That's the level of his thinking. So yeah, one day I'll do a video, something along those lines, because I think he is a fascinating character. Beesman, thank you very much for a very generous super chat. Thank you. Saying, let's wish George R. R. Martin good health for 20 plus years, and maybe we'll get a Song of Ice and Fire, Silmarillion type book answering question. Doubt deities being explained, since that's part of the appeal, but Tower of Joy, full explanation, who knows? Yeah, absolutely wishing him good health for many, many years. In order for us to get the complete answer from his perspective to all of this, I think we need the last two books on the Song of Ice and Fire, all of Dunk and Egg, and Fire and Blood Part 2, plus the Tourney at Harrenhal stage play. I think once we've got all those things done, that will give us, in his mind, the story. Now, there might be extra bits that he might wish to authorize or tick that happen in TV shows, but I think that's the story, when he means the big meta-narrative of the story that's going to happen. Can he get all that done? I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I hope so. So let's stick with the I hope so, and wishing him all the best for the 20 plus years. I think in terms of that question, though, I agree completely with the idea of this, him answering questions, because the Silmarillion doesn't answer all of the questions, but what we do have with Tolkien, to take a digression over to Tolkien for a while, what we do have with Tolkien is many, many years of him answering questions. People would write to him, and then he'd reply, and then he'd write a random essay about how the Palantiri work, or what was going on with the Hunt for the Ring, or what's the nature of lembas bread, whatever. He just wrote lots of random essays about things, and so we have huge amounts of information from him. What we've had from George R. R. Martin is, because he doesn't want to spoil things, is silence in answering questions now for a long time. He did used to answer a lot of questions. Now he very, very rarely does. In fact, he very, very rarely appears in public these days in open forums where he does get asked these kinds of questions. He used to go to do lots of these kind of open forums where people will ask him lots. He now, I mean, partly this is pandemic stuff, but he doesn't do that so much. So yes, that's what I really want, is when we get to this point where he can answer the questions, because there will still be, no matter how all-encompassing what he writes is, there will always be some questions for him. Will he write a sort of a Silmarillion? I don't think so. I think his meta narrative is more about everything is from somebody's perspective, and we, the reader, have to try and figure out what truth is, because this is showing us the limits of both written history and lived history, and this, getting into a little bit of literary analysis here, but these are the two things that he keeps on playing as sources of information and truth, that he keeps on playing one against the other. We have what the Maesters do, which is history books, which is telling us this is what happened, X, Y, and Z happened. But we know, yes, there's lots of information in there, but we know that there's limits to that, because that comes from the perspective of one person, and they're building that on what information they get, and the information they get may be limited. Much better, clearly, are lived experiences of people. However, the lived experiences of people are also limited. They only know the things that they know. They are guided by their own principles, and their thoughts are based very much on what they believe. And he's constantly showing us the two sides of this. And I have a feeling that this will end up in a meta way showing us these two types of history, the history books, the academic history, and the lived history. And I think they sort of tried to show that on the TV show by having, and they turned it sort of into a joke, really. They had, if you remember one of the last scenes, Sam comes in with this massive tome there. The Maesters have now written a history of this time period. And then Tyrion sort of opens it and says, well, where am I? And it's like, oh, you've been written out of it. And it's, oh, ha, 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 you've been written out of history. George R. R. Martin does like showing us that the history is written by the victors. And this is... Rhaenyra is not counted as one of the line of Targaryen rulers, despite the fact that she was named heir, crowned, and ruled undisputedly in King's Landing for 6 months. She was written out of history because the people who wrote the history books decided not to, and Aegon II said, no, she's not going to be counted as a proper queen. So, as a meta-narrative, that's where we're going to be ending up. And that, I think, means we're not going to get the equivalent of a Silmarillion. We're going to get Fire and Blood and the World of Ice and Fire to show the kind of the Maester approach, and we're going to get the other things, A Song of Ice and Fire and Duncan Egg, to show the kind of that lived experience approach. I think I had another question... let's go to a question from username Redacted. Theory. Bloodraven dies by the others in the cave. Bloodraven tries to skin change to Bran. Bran fights him off, but is stained by Bloodraven's corrupted soul, leading to Tyrant King Bran warging all lords simultaneously to ensure peace. Wow. A good theory, I think. Bloodraven tries to skin change into Bran. Bran fights him off. I could sort of see that in a way as a possibility. The idea of Bran warging all lords simultaneously to ensure peace. I can't see that as a likely way through. That doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but I don't think he's going to. If you're going to ensure peace at the end by walking into all the Lord, they will know that somebody's done this to them, and you either then have to be in control of them forever, in which case he is literally a puppet master, or you then release them and they're going, right, who did that? And that's not going to be a way to peace. So I don't personally think that's the way we're going to go on this one, but I like the idea. Kelly Summers saying Dunk is Forrest Gump, right? I mean, it's not far off, but that's the kind of feel we've got for this. I mean, maybe George R. Martin loves his weird references. Whether we get Dunk coming up with "Life is like a box of chocolates," he has his sayings. One of the things which is like that is he has his sayings that he comes back to. Dunk the lunk, thick as a castle wall, and always talking about or thinking about what Sir Alan Pennytree would have said. He has got these kind of repetitive thoughts that he has, which is very different to the other characters that he writes in A Song of Ice and Fire, it has to be said. Cloak One talking about Dunk saying he's magical in the way that while he himself isn't magical, magic may be drawn or more easily expressed around him, ? Yeah, absolutely. Beesman saying other powerful people recognizing him as important might be magic enough without any metaphysical magic needed. Call it materialist's view of karma or whatever. That's enough sometimes. Curtis Frank saying Dunk is an agent of destiny. Callie Summers saying, or for an American history reference, Dunk is Robert Lincoln, the president's son who was there for the death of 3 presidents. I don't know that story. But it sounds like an interesting bit of history. So the same person was the deaths of 3 presidents. Okay. Wheezy Squeezebox saying Dunk would totally stick out in the crowd of the denizens of Flea Bottom. Well, yes, but when he was younger, he wasn't as tall, so perhaps not. Andrew Kay saying, whatever we get, at least George R. Martin seems to have prioritized certain projects and seems content with his choices. Yeah, he certainly seems content with his choices. My concern is that if he prioritized one thing, I think we can be pretty sure that's going to happen. But if he's prioritizing everything, which is literally what he said, then there's a chance that we won't get anything. So we will. We will get things. Let's not be too down on this. David, thank you very much for the super chat. Didn't see a question there. If you did have one, just pop it in the chat, and one of the moderators will pick it up and flag it so I can see it. Don't think anyone has yet. Let's go to a question from Lady Maze Mormont saying, I'm currently reading the first Fire and Blood and comparing the stories of the past to the stories of the present in A Song of Ice and Fire. Considering that George R. R. Martin tends to follow the theme of history repeating itself, what pieces of history do you think will be detailed in Fire and Blood 2 that line up with the current story? For instance, which king do you think Bran would most resemble in his rule? Well, I don't think Bran will resemble any of them. And personally, I think that which sounds like quite a blunt answer, but I think that's deliberate on George R. R. Martin's part, is that he will want Bran to appear different to all of these Targaryens. That's so you can do historical contrasts as well as you can do historical echoes, and I think that's where that's going to be. Also, I think we're going to end up in a situation with A Song of Ice and Fire, certainly, perhaps not with the wider TV world. We'll have to wait and see, where we don't see really much of Bran as king. I think when he's king, that will be largely the end of the story. So I don't think we'll see that. But in terms of your wider question about what sort of echoes we might get, I think so. Summerhall, we already know, I think, some of the echoes that that we've got going on there, but they will start to be pulled out a whole lot more. So this is about fire. This is about dragon eggs. This is about deaths of 3 deaths, and the birth of a dragon being Rhaegar, and that obviously is echoed in Daenerys with Khal Drogo's funeral pyre and the births of the 3 dragons there. We've got things like Robert's Rebellion and the Blackfire Rebellion. They will have knock-on effects clearly into the stories that we know. And also Bloodraven will have a sort of a knock-on effect. I wonder whether we're going to get a lot of characters that we start to see echoes of them, or actually who they are. So, for example, my pet theory about Quaithe is that it's Shira Seastar. So we may well see what her role is and her relationship with Bloodraven. I think this will make this, if it's true, extra. I was trying to think of what the pathos. They give some extra pathos to it, because what we've got basically is Bloodraven has picked his champion, Jon. He thinks that this is the person who's going to be the prince that was promised, who's going to be saving the day against the others. Quaithe has picked her champion. She thinks it's Dany, and she has been pushing Dany along all of this time. Now, the two of them will clash and come together. But if what's happened is that Bloodraven and Quaithe have chosen their champions completely not knowing that the other person is there or still alive. We know that Bloodraven searched for these people, including Shira Seastar, and couldn't find her. That would be so touching if they were lovers who shared a vision, as almost certainly seems to be the case, and they were both magical and went off on different magical routes, and as a result came to different conclusions over a long period of time and created different champions. That would be pretty amazing, and to get that set up in Fire and Blood Part 2, I would love it. Absolutely love it. As I say, it's just a pet theory. The evidence is there, but it's not conclusive, it has to be said. DM Collins saying, will we meet the original still living Cold Hands in Fire and Blood 2? Or maybe we have already met him in Dunk and Egg. So this I will refer you on to, and you may be building on this anyway, a video I did a couple of weeks ago, Who is Cold Hands? Now, this was a collaboration with History of Westeros. If you've not come across History of Westeros, fantastic channel, fantastic podcast, experts on everything to do with Westeros. And indeed, I think it's fair to say Aziz from History of Westeros, when at Con of Thrones, they've done quizzes about minutiae of details of the world of Ice and Fire. All of the fans were there. Aziz won, so they know their stuff. I've done a series of collaborative videos with them, which I've really enjoyed. I think they've been some of the best things that I've been producing on my channel, with having the added expertise there. The most recent one we did was about Cold Hands. Who is Cold Hands? And the conclusion we've come is that we can't say for certain. And I'm not going to go through all of the evidence, but the most likely, he says, spoiling his own video again. You always do this, Robert. Oh, well. The most likely is that this is one of the Raven's teeth, probably a trusted lieutenant of Bloodraven's from way back when he was Hand of the King, who came up with him to the wall, followed him north of the wall as well, as part of that ranging party. Bloodraven got hooked up to the Weirwood network, and Cold Hands was killed by the whites, but then brought back by the children. Something along those lines. So if that's the case, then will we see him in Fire and Blood Part 2? Possibly, but we won't know. And that's the sad thing, is we will not know. We will just know perhaps the names of a couple of these Raven's Teeth who go north to the Wall with Bloodraven. But that sort of is the point with Cold Hands, is that we don't need to know his name. The point is that he is like a nameless soldier, an unknown soldier who is just doing his duty, and that's the point with Cold Hands. He deliberately doesn't give his name. He deliberately keeps his identity a mystery so that Bran just does not know, and we in the audience do not know. So George R. R. Martin is deliberately keeping it from us as well. Break2630 saying, what were the major events for each Lord Paramount house between the dance to the beginning of the reign of King Aerys? Well, that's quite a big question. I think so I won't go through each house all the way through a couple of 100 years worth of history. What I will say is what is fascinating, and I talked about these threads that has been left at the end of Fire and Blood Part 1. What is fascinating is how the rulers of almost all of the major houses, the Lords Paramount, after the Dance of the Dragons, are children. They are young, inexperienced. They've often got maybe a mother is there who's ruling with them. That's certainly the case for the Lannisters. But the people in charge are very, very young. And this makes for a fascinating dynamic. It also adds, interestingly, to when I was talking about how much power Grand Maester Monken had. That was during this time. Not only did he have all the power of being the regent and the hand of the king and the only member of the small council and being in charge of all of the maesters, but also none of the lords of the realm were paying any attention because they just survived a civil war to start with, and also they were children. So he could get away with whatever he wanted to. Slight digression. But what that means is that for the period that we've got in the first part of Fire and Blood Part 2, we've got a new generation growing up, a completely new series of Lords Paramount across the Seven Kingdoms. So what we have, though, and I kind of touched on this when I was talking about House Stark, is increasingly we have this jockeying for power among the main houses, trying to get close to the Targaryens, which we had to a degree in Fire and Blood Part 1, but because there were dragons involved and because the Targaryens were very much just marrying their own, sometimes marrying House Velaryon, very, very rarely marrying someone else, that actually getting into that inner circle, it was quite hard. What happens increasingly as we move through the years of what will be Fire and Blood Part 2 is increasingly we find the houses towards the south trying to marry in and gain influence that way. House Martell do this, they marry in. We get the Arryns do, that we get a lot of houses as just trying to get in on the action. Aegon V was deliberately trying to get his children set up with big noble houses. It didn't work, but the plan was there to marry them off to all of these other noble houses, therefore solidifying the rule of the Targaryens by creating alliances with other people. Both sides started to realize that was an important part of post-Dragon Targaryen rule. Reflective Rambling saying, okay, so if Quaithe and Bloodraven have champions and Melisandre has a champion and Euron his own champion, there's some sort of tapestry I'm not seeing. Yeah, it's a complicated one, it has to be said. But if you wish to add to the tapestry, you get Euron is sort of a rejected champion from Bloodraven. the imagery is very Bloodraven-y with him, with the one eye and the crow and things like that. Let's go to a question from sure. It seems that House Peak is often involved in rebellions. Do you think we will see more of them in Fire and Blood Part 2? Yes, we will. This is another one of those threads which is sort of left over. Unwin Peak, who tried, he had a valiant attempt. I mean, it was quite an underhanded attempt, but a bold attempt to gain power by marrying his daughter into the Targaryen royal family, and just got shot down. He basically lost all power. The Peaks were the most powerful. He was regent. He was Hand of the King. He was most powerful for a very short period, and then he got shot down. Will he return? Almost certainly. He's a very ambitious man. We will see a bit more of him, I suspect. But House Peak are they're ambitious. But they choose the wrong sides. So we will see them again. They are major supporters of Daemon Blackfire. So major, in fact, they have 3 castles, House Peak. At the end of the first Blackfire Rebellion, they survive, but they get 2 of their 3 castles taken away from them. Then the second Blackfire Rebellion happens. They're involved in that again. Their lord gets killed. Then we get, and we don't get much information about this, but what happens is something called the Peak Uprising, which appears to be House Peak just suddenly turning around and going, you know what? We'll just take on the Targaryens ourselves. Trying to stage their own civil war. Doesn't work. They get completely destroyed. But we will see from them again. But I think it's going to be increasingly tragically. They had a chance of power. They were an ancient and powerful house. They had a chance of getting power, but they keep on backing the wrong horses and lose it over time. 444 saying, hi Robert, for the second part of Fire and Blood, I wonder about 2 things the most. First, what happened to Alice Rivers? Is she a mother of Aemon's child? And what about the dragon? And secondly, who is Bloodraven's beloved brother? Let's answer the first one. Alice Rivers is another one of these loose threads left over, probably the most prominent of the loose threads left over after Fire and Blood Part 1. She was Aemon Targaryen's lover and claimed to have a dragon and his baby, who she then claimed was the rightful king. Now, we get a couple of colourful incidents where she's at Harrenhal then, and then the Crown sends some people to go and just sort her out. Small detachment. They get chased away. She seems to use some magic to make sure that people take her seriously. She sends a messenger back, and the messenger says that I've been told, Alice Rivers says, if you laugh at me, then I will die here on the spot. So nobody laugh at me. And then he proceeds to say what she said to him. Somebody laughs, and then he chokes to death on the spot. And it's like, okay, that seems to be some quite dark and powerful magic going on there. So she will have to be dealt with in some way. We don't know what happens to her from what we've already had in the World of Ice and Fire, but she will almost certainly die in some way. The Crown will take her out. But she's got a large period, what we know of time, from where Fire and Blood Part 2 picks up through to when the next noble family gets given Harrenhal is 15 years. How Thlothston take it over. There's 15 years. So she could be there with her supporters for anywhere up to 15 years. Personally, I suspect what will happen, because everything kind of adds up. We've got a dragon left, one dragon left for House Targaryen Morning, who can be ridden in, and I do wonder whether that dragon will go and attack Harrenhal and take out Alice Rivers, because it would need something of that magnitude to do that. And maybe that is what persuades Aegon III, because he has a huge change of heart. He hates dragons, and then suddenly at some point he thinks, actually, dragons would be quite useful. Maybe it's seeing Morning in action that leads him to this conclusion, that he sees there's this problem we've had for a long time. The dragon went in and solved it. Maybe we do need to get some more dragons. So perhaps that's where that's going to go. But she's going to cause some troubles, and Harrenhal, incidentally, I think we'll see a lot more of in Fire and Blood Part 2. It's the number of people who are there during this period, house after house after house, all of them having tragedies. So we're going to see a lot of Harrenhal. The second part of your question, who is the brother that Bloodraven loved? So he says he had a sister he loved, a brother he hated, and a brother he loved. Obviously, Chelsea Star he loved. The one he hated seems to be Bittersteel, Aegon Rivers. That seems to be reasonably beyond doubt. The one he loved, we've got two options here, and the default answer, the most logical one, the simplest answer, the Occam's razor answer, is Diran, his brother who became the king. He backs him. He kills Daemon Blackfire, and he is staunchly loyal to Diran all the way through. So that's the obvious answer. But there is a school of thought out there that actually the brother that Bloodraven loved was Daemon himself. And he loved him, he just didn't want him doing the Blackfire Rebellion. He hated Aegon Rivers for putting this thought into Daemon's mind. He did kill him, but he didn't want to, and that would add an extra layer of tragedy into this. So is there any evidence for this? Not much, it has to be said, but it would add such an extra element there. And it's worth noting, I think, that George R. R. Martin has included quite a few, particularly more recently, not so much in the earlier books, but more recently has included quite a few gay and lesbian characters in his stories, but not whereas lots of Targaryens fall in love with other Targaryens, that tends to be quite heterosexual couples, man and a woman marrying. I don't think we've had any kind of queer Targaryen / Targaryen relationships. We've had queer Targaryens, but we've not had any queer Targaryen relationships with other Targaryens. So I'm not saying that this is the case. I'm just saying it's a possibility because of the language use that we've got here from Bloodraven saying that he loved a brother. In what way? We don't know. Okay, so Andrew Case saying, I think that Daemon is an interesting candidate, makes it that much harder when he had to do what he did, and shows the lengths Bloodraven is willing to go to for his cause. Yeah, it shows what Bloodraven, he's willing to sacrifice everything for what he thinks is the greater good. Agree with saying hot dragon on dragon action. Yeah, whether George R. R. Martin will show it is a different matter. Let's go to a question from Mike McFly. Do you think that George R. R. Martin will focus a bit more on the dragonish stillborn Targaryen babies? I know it has been touched on, but wondering if he tells us if the longer and further in time the Targaryens stopped going on blind dates at the family reunions, maybe the percentage of the deformities lessened, or if it is just something that will always be a dormant gene. So in Fire and Blood Part 1, this was one of the things that they didn't really speculate on too much. Gildane tells the history, and he sort of starts to slightly dabbles in the whys about this, but not much. He will say, the rumors are that this was a baby was born that was deformed, and this is a curse of the Targaryens or something like that. But he doesn't want to go into it too much, which is in character. The Maesters tend not to like to talk about magic stuff. They tend not to want to think about it all that much. So it's just la 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 la. So no, he doesn't tend to speculate. I'm not expecting in Fire and Blood Part 2 suddenly he will start theorizing about the nature of the link between Targaryens and dragons. What he will show us is Targaryens without dragons, and maybe he will do some thinking about how this impacted on them and how the increasing numbers of Targaryens would become obsessed with getting a dragon. I'm not sure we'll get the sort of the malformed Targaryen babies as a thought project for him. Reflective Rambling, picking up for Emma Sherman, saying, "Hi, Robert. I'm curious who the new sources will be in Part 2 and how that might influence the book's tone." Yeah, well, the book's tone will carry on being Gildane. But yes, he will need new sources. I don't know if we have met who these sources are yet. It's possible that it will be other maesters who will almost certainly rely on the work of other maesters. Maybe some septons again. It's people who are in the room. The question from and I think they will probably be quite generic. But there are two things which will interest me, which are, firstly, will he have an equivalent of the mushroom character, as in somebody who gives the alternative bit of history, the more salacious bit? Because if you do just have septons and maesters, you are going to get a less interesting version of history. It's going to be very prudish. So where is he going to get this kind of thing from? Particularly, I think when we get the reign of someone like Aegon IV, even from what we know, lots of debauched stuff happened. Are the Maesters going to tell us huge amounts about that? Perhaps not. So maybe we're going to get some other person who's going to give us their thoughts. The other thing which I will find fascinating is whether or not any of these sources will be characters that we know. If you're writing about Robert's Rebellion, who's going to be a good source on that? You can go with the approach that they broadly had in The World of Ice and Fire, which is not really talking about the sources so much, just doing and I'm telling you what happened. But Fire and Blood does use sources. Which sources are we going to use for that? It would have to be somebody that we know. I like the idea. Maybe we will pick up on some things from Maester Ayman, perhaps. Maybe we'll pick up from one of the High Septons that we know, not from the High Sparrow, but someone like that. I struggle to think of who we might, as one of the characters we know, have as a source, but we must have a source who covers that period of time, and just having the Maesters doesn't seem right. Bloodraven could be a source, says Kolnitsky. Yeah, I mean, I'd love it. I don't know whether or not Bloodraven will have left any written notes. That doesn't seem to be how he worked, unless he was trying to influence something, which maybe he would. That would be okay. Now thinking about it, that would be quite meta if we get something from Bloodraven which has been left that we as a reader can then start to see and think, oh, maybe this is Bloodraven trying to influence people through this book that is being written, but he's trying to influence people in world. That adds an extra layer of meta to what we've got going on. Andrew K talking about the Tom Bombadil song. That's 400,000. Yes, so you've got a little way to go. I'm 370 something thousand at the moment, I think. So a little way to go, and then we'll get there. But that's for those who don't know what I'm talking about. My moderators and subscribers, as a little thank you for what they do. They have, I don't know whether I can quite call it a tradition yet, but when I reach milestones of subscribers, they get a little reward, which was last time I put on my hood that I wore in the very early days, which they appreciated. And I have promised to sing a Tom Bombadil song when we hit 400k subscribers, which I'm not going to advertise as a thing to be looking forward to, but it's a thank you. Anyway, Stephanie Frederick suggesting maybe for 500k wearing the hood and singing. I mean, this is getting too much now. Okay, so let's go to a question from Shasha. Do you think there will be an explanation as to why Aegon IV, who by all accounts was an awful person, could have reigned for so long without being violently dethroned? Maegor was probably as evil, and he seems to at least have been a competent battle commander, yet he still only ruled half as long before pretty much definitely being killed, while Aegon died somewhat naturally. I cannot see any evidence that Aegon's politics outweighed his personality by being brilliant, and it is probably a little early to blame his long reign on Bloodraven. Okay, well, this is a really interesting question. Why did Aegon IV not get overthrown? So I think we have an answer to this. It will be interesting to see whether this is backed up by Fire and Blood Part 2. He reigned for 12 years, which is a long time, but it's not a crazy long time. When he started, he was, as far as we can tell, he was a very charismatic guy. The women in particular, we're told, were very fond of him. So he seems to started out okay. How long would that have lasted? I don't know, a couple of years or so. But that's where we start off with. Then he starts sleeping around. He starts his court becomes quite a corrupt place. He seems quite fickle, hiring and firing people, handing out rewards to people here, getting somebody killed over there. Corrupt is Aegon the Unworthy is what he was called. It was a corrupt kingdom. Now, the answer I think we have here is very much that this was, from a few angles, this was the kind of thing which people saw opportunities in. This wasn't a static way of ruling. This was a chance for people to get ahead in life. This was a chance for people, they could see new opportunities were rising all the time. Maybe they could, if they put a bribe in here, maybe if they made the right friend there, maybe they could get themselves a lordship. There were people who could see opportunities who would not get those opportunities in a more boring reign. So that was one aspect of it. The second is that his corruptness and his bad behavior seems to have been quite parochial, let's say. It seems to have been in his court, in King's Landing, or when he went to a place, that would be what happened there. He never seemed to get involved so much in mega politics. He, as far as we're aware, maybe we'll find out that he did, but as far as we're aware, then he didn't start picking fights with House Lannister. He didn't sort of call for the Starks to come down and then behead some of them. That's not the kind of thing that he did, which other Targaryen rulers definitely did. So the Lords Paramount, and we're actually told this in the World of Ice and Fire, the main lords basically just thought, well, they can ignore it. It just doesn't actually affect them. Okay, yes, so maybe he goes off and sleeps with some people that he shouldn't do, and that's very annoying and naughty him. But they just thought that's just what kings do, and they could just forget about it. Doesn't affect House Stark, House Arryn, House Tyrell. They can just do their own thing. He can sort of run around King's Landing and rule a corrupt realm. I'll just rule my area here. It'll be fine. So I think that kind of feel was there for the middle part of his reign. The end of his reign, people could see coming. He grew corpulent. He grew very unwell. He was like the picture of somebody who's going to die very, very soon. And as a result, the people who were thinking we must overthrow this king were already thinking, okay, maybe we just look to the next generation. Who is it we want to back? And so everybody who was perhaps not liking Aegon IV, they were instead thinking, do I support Daeron? How about this guy Daemon? Maybe we could support him. Would that give us an opportunity? So I think we see three broad phases. The first phase, he seems to be not that bad. We don't know how long that lasted. The second phase, yeah, he was pretty rotten, but it seemed to be very kind of local to the court and wherever he happened to be. Most people could ignore it. And then the third phase was he was going to die anyway, so let's focus on who takes over rather than him, which I think is the answer, but it will be fascinating whether Fire and Blood Part 2 agrees with that. Andrew Case saying, don't even think it's close to me. Aegon IV was by far the worst Targaryen king by a long way. I mean, I'm not sure I would agree with that. I think Aerys II towards the end got worse. I think Maegor was worse. I think there were, for me, your marriage clearly differs, but for me, I think that there were worse. I don't think that he stood out as being particularly worse than some of the others. Reflective Rambling saying, want to catch a mix match of thoughts, images, and shots of our best boy Dan the dog? Check out In Deep Geek on Instagram. Yeah, that's what I use Instagram for. Don't expect regular content. Don't expect not very. I tried for a while to do some proper curated content on there. I don't really have the energy for it. But if you want incredibly random pictures of me going on a walk, or here's a nice castle I've just found, or here's some nice screenshots from Lord of the Rings, here's a picture I like, that kind of thing, I'll just randomly throw them on there. I am on Instagram, so do check me out. I think I'm In Deep Geek Official over there. And if you want all my socials, I'm also on Twitter. I am on Twitch. In fact, I'm on Twitch now. I always forget to say this. I am simul streaming. I'm not checking on chat over on Twitch, so apologies if you're on Twitch and you're chatting away. Hi. But just if you find it easier to watch it via Twitch, then do that. And I will soon be on TikTok. Okay, so that's I think that's on Facebook. I'm on Facebook as well. You can check me out on, I don't do huge amounts on there. Twitter is where I do most of my kind of social media stuff. Okay, let's go to DM Colin saying, I think if you started a second channel just called Dogs and Castles, I would definitely subscribe. Yeah, well, maybe I will one day. Maybe I will. Question from Mara Lee. What information, stories, characters are you looking forward to reading about in part 2? And how do you plan to cover it? I've talked about how I will cover it. But in terms of what I'm personally looking forward to, I talked about the loose end. This is the thing I just wanted to pick on, because I've talked about a few of these loose ends, but there are a few more that I just want to mention. well, the first one, which is the biggest one, which is the dragons. It's the death of the dragons and how that happened. We've got 4 living dragons at the start of Fire and Blood Part 2. Now, we could reasonably expect 1 or 2 of them to die naturally of old age, but all 4 within this period of time, all 4, that seems unlikely. So something happens. How do the dragons die? We think we know why new dragons aren't hatched, new living dragons aren't hatched, but how do the ones that are already alive, how do they die? Because if we take this theory that the Maesters decided they'll poison all the dragon eggs because they can get their hands on them, because yes, there are probably quite a few of them, but not so many that they can't count them, and the Maesters will know where they are. If we take the idea that they hatch the dragon eggs, that they poison the dragon eggs, they also need to make sure that the living dragons don't lay any more, because that would just break all of their plans apart. So they must have had the second part of their plan must be about those dragons dying. How does that happen? That's something which fascinates me. The other bits are linked in with the main story. Bloodraven and the Great Bastards. I'd love to see this. The relationship between them will be brilliant to see. I cannot wait for that. The interactions with the stories that we know with Robert's Rebellion and Duncan Egg, definitely, and also the how Dawn was brought in to the Seven Kingdoms. That there's a story there which often gets glossed over because it's not that exciting or sexy, but this Dawn held out for so long and was unbowed, unbent, unbroken, and it's all very well saying, and they decided actually, all right, we'll sign a marriage pact and we'll come and join. What prompted that? There must be more than just this. Let's stop all this fighting. They completely changed around. I want to get into that, the detail of that. How is it that Dawn, who was so fiercely independent, to the extent of they must have suffered hundreds of thousands of people dying, why did they suddenly go, okay, well, we'll join you? There seems to be a need for more than what we've read so far. Okay, let's go to some questions. I think we've got some. I think those are my questions from my patrons that are specifically about Fire and Blood Part 2. So I'm happy to take some more questions in the chat. Chris92 Giles saying, can you do more regular length videos? I can't commit to your 3-hour jobbies. I completely understand. I think some people love the longer format of me just talking for a while. Some people prefer the shorter videos. That's absolutely fine. I'm very happy for you to pick and choose what you want. I'm trying to get up to 2 a week of the normal videos. When we get to the shows happening, House of the Dragon and the Rings of Power, I'll take a step up. I'll do a little bit more than that then. We'll see how many I can do without killing myself each week. But there will be more regular length videos during that time, definitely. The live stream, I just enjoy doing the live streams. I do 1 a week. It's nice. It's great. The engaging with the chat, I really enjoy. So I completely understand, though, if that's not for you. But yeah, there will be more regular length videos coming along soon. Reflective Rambling, picking up on a question from Thomas Hertinger, saying, hey, Robert, do you think the long night in the Song of Ice and Fire will be a solar eclipse? No. I think this will be... So the others bring the winter. And it's more than just it is wintry conditions. We see it specifically in the prologue to book 1. We feel it. The temperature of the air just plummets, and everything becomes hugely cold, and we don't get to, they're in a forest, so we don't get to see the sky, but if it's going to be snowing, there will be lots of cloud cover. It's going to get darker. That's where the long night comes. They are bringing it with them. So I don't think it's a lunar eclipse. My general take on this kind of stuff comes also from George R. R. Martin, who, when he's asked about various cosmological explanations for the seasons being out of balance and the long night, he actually gives them quite short shrift. If you go back and look at what he says, he just says, it's a fantasy world. There is a fantasy explanation for this. So don't go looking for a scientific explanation. So that's my take on this, is that the long night is brought by the others, and it's not a solar eclipse or anything that we can explain in a scientific way. Beesman saying, off topic, feel free to skip, or answers from the chat are welcome. Introducing a friend to Witcher books, what would be the recommended order? She played the games. My answer was release date order, but with Lady of the Lake, I am unsure. Okay, so basically there are 2 books of short stories, Last Wish and... See, it's been so long since I've done the Witcher stuff. Someone will remind me in the chat who that is. Always have a mind blank at some point, every live stream. Then you get the 5 novels of the main story, starting with Blood of Elves and moving on through. So Lady of the Lake ends that. So don't start there. I would start with the short stories. Then the sort of the chronological order goes through them, through Sword of Destiny. There we go. Didn't even need to check in the chat. So we get the 2 short stories, Last Wish, Sword of Destiny. Then you go into the 5 novels. There is another one, Season of Storms, which he wrote years later, which probably you should read afterwards, but actually takes place somewhere between the short stories and the main novels. I say you should probably read it after, because it's him thematically wrapping this all up. But if you wish to read it in chronological order, that's it. So yeah, no, I'm great. Very glad you're doing that. What I would say to somebody who's new to the Witcher story, if they've done the video games come after all of this, basically. We get the story, and then we get the in the books, and then we get the video games come after this. The thing I would say to somebody new to the Witcher books is that they're not what you expect. They start being what you expect they are, and I happily and openly say, when I started reading them, my first thought was, this is just kind of like sub-Conan world, this macho guy going around hitting monsters with a sword. The further in you get, the more you realize that this isn't the main focus of this. It actually isn't Geralt of Rivia at all, and there is a bigger theme going on here. I was talking about George R. R. Martin with one of his big themes being about the nature of memory, how we record memory, lived experience, or recorded history. Andrei Sapkowski talks, or the deeper into it you get, in fact, when you get to the Lady of the Lake towards the end of it, this is almost entirely about the nature of story. What is it about story that is important? How important is the truth of a story? Does it matter if there are lots of different versions of a story? Is it that the most important one is the one that speaks to you, or is it the one that's closer to the truth, or is it the one that is going to carry on and persist? What does that mean? These are big questions that he's grappling with. It starts out feeling quite small, but it grows. And just as a complete aside, this does explain for me, when I've been pondering this, is how Andrzej Sapkowski can be so laid back about the Witcher adaptation to TV. Because you get, say, George R. R. Martin, who is wanting to be exec producer on everything. He wants to meet everybody who's going to be making some TV shows based on his work. Forgetting what happened with Game of Thrones for a moment, I think he's learned from that experience. But he says he's very, very involved in all of them. He says he wants to make sure that they are canonical. That's his approach to this. Andrzej Sapkowski with The Witcher, his approach has been completely hands off. He said, he was asked, do you want to be involved? Do you want to help write them? Do you want to have a veto on anything? And he said, no, all I want is to be able to see them before they aired publicly, so that I know when people ask me questions, I know what to say. And that's it. And for a while, it made me go, well, how can you be so hands off about your babies, your stories? But the more I think about it, the more I realize this is the nature of what he's been writing about, is the nature of stories and how there can be different versions, and they can differ hugely. And the debate about what is right and good about them is the important thing. So, again, we've gone slightly into literary criticism here, and perhaps that wasn't the answer that you're wanting. You were just asking for a reading order. But it's something that I've been thinking about, and hopefully you found that an interesting digression. The short answer is short stories first, then the main novels, then Season of Storms afterwards. Cloaked One saying, well said about the Witcher books. That was my reaction. Pleasantly surprised at the sheer depth of the novels, especially compared to some of the earlier games. So the games, I'm not a big gamer myself, but I've dabbled. The games tend to, because they're video games, they tend to default into the Witcher as somebody who's killing monsters. But my bigger concern, I think, is with the difference in character. The character of Geralt in the books he's erudite, he's learned. It doesn't always come across in the video games. I don't think it always came across. And Henry Cavill, to be fair to him, pointed this out. It didn't always come across in season 1 of The Witcher on the TV either. Let's go with Mike McFly. This is to sort of random questions now. Mike McFly, this question has been in my head for a while, but because of your video a few weeks ago about George R. R. Martin and his qualms about Tolkien, showing you can still love something but have a few problems with it. George R. R. Martin said he wasn't happy with the way Aragorn's rule was just laid out in a general manner at the end, just a few sentences about the 100 years and the land prospered. George R. R. Martin, of course, famously wanted to know about his tax policy. I've done a video. This is probably the spark for this is what was Aragorn's tax policy. And in my head, says Mike, I think what he's done with Fire and Blood Part 1 and possibly Part 2 is equally frustrating for me, but perhaps a bit more frustrating. He tells the deeds of the rulers and what made them good or bad or both, but the only problem is for a lot of the details he wrote about, he purposely wrote it so that we have no idea if it is true. So which do I find more satisfying rather than entertaining? Having Tolkien tell us straight out what happened, but in less detail, or George R. R. Martin tell us the rule of the land by kings? B, you can't be sure if it actually happened in universe. So, okay, this is a really interesting question. So, I love both George R. R. Martin and J.R.R. Tolkien. So I say any critiques here are with love. The George R. R. Martin did critique Tolkien's approach to kings, and basically he says, what Tolkien did was said Aragorn was a good king because he was a good man and the land prospered, and that's not good enough to just say that. What I want to know is, what was Aragorn's tax policy? My video was trying to answer that, actually, because that's the kind of brain I have. I go, I wonder what Aragorn's tax policy was. So if you're interested, go and check out the video. In answer to the question, I think George R. R. Martin is slightly doing a disservice to Tolkien here. He probably realizes that he's got quite a tongue-in-cheek sense of humor, George R. R. Martin, at times. Tolkien's meta story ended at the end of the Third Age, when Aragorn became king. What happens after that, he does just literally give us a few sentences of what happens going on from there, just to help us as readers to know what happens to the characters that we love. So he tells us what, and Sam goes back and marries Rosie, and he becomes mayor of Mickle Delving, and then Legolas and Gimli go off on a road trip, and eventually they both head off in a boat. So he gives us this little hints about what the characters do afterwards, which is nice, and it means that we get some extra sense of ending to those characters and what they're about. But as a whole, his story ended at the end of the Third Age. He did start writing a sequel to The Lord of the Rings. If you're completely unaware of this, it always comes as a surprise to us. There are some people who go, wait, what? He wrote a sequel to The Lord of the... He did start writing a sequel. He only ever got, I think, 17 pages in. He tried it 3 times, same story, and he abandoned it. He just didn't like where it was going. I did do a video on that if you're interested as well, if you want to know what it was and why he abandoned it. But he never did a complete story in the Fourth Age going forward. So when we have the little we know about Aragorn's rule, that is the context there, that is just Tolkien just giving us a few hints. And he's telling us, yeah, he was a good ruler, the land prospered, all was good. And that's all we needed to know. So I think it's a little unfair of George R. R. Martin to critique that. It would be the equivalent of if he ended his stories with, let's say, Bran on the throne, and gave us a little epilogue that said, and Bran ruled for the next 50 years, and under his rule, this happened and that happened, and the Seven Kingdoms prospered once more, full stop. He's not expanding on that because he doesn't have to expand on that. It would be wrong to critique that as saying, well, we don't know anymore. What was Bran's tax policy? So I think it's a little unfair. In terms of sort of the bigger question you're asking, which do I prefer, this very accurate but concise and quite short version of what's happened, or a much bigger version that we can't be 100% sure of the truth of it? That I think is kind of playing into the George R. R. Martin's style here, is that he wants us to ask these questions, which is the best. Personally, I think both have a place. I don't have a favorite. I think that because they're talking about different kinds of things, if we're comparing like with like, we'd have to compare what we know about the rule of Jaehaerys II with what we know about the rule of I don't know, Gil-galad or something like that. And in that, what we have is different styles from the two. We think we know quite a lot about what Jaehaerys was doing. Gil-galad, there are some big gaps, but Tolkien gave us huge amounts of information around that. So, I mean, I think I don't have a favourite, is what I'm saying, and I know that feels like a cop out, but I think that we're there are two narrative styles, and I think they both work for me. And I love them both. Sorry. Okay, let's go to a question. Let's go to a question from Children of Jack Acid. This would be more about the history that precedes the Targaryen invasion, but I need to get it off my chest. Is no one else bothered by the fact that we have no histories about Valyria from the Valyrians themselves, nor any technical manuals or travel books or dragon maintenance manuals, slave galley guides or plays or songs or satires or anything that came from the pen of a Valyrian? Have Martin or his co-writers mentioned the name of any Valyrian authors or book titles penned by Valyrians? Tyrion is just gaga about Lumos Longstrider's travel diaries, but why does he have to rely on Westerosi when you would expect the Valyrians themselves to get a far better view of the world to write from? Surely if the Valyrians ruled the world, people in all corners of the free cities and abroad would want to bask in their cultural glow by reading things that Valyrians had written. So where are the books? In the Citadel, I think, is the answer to this. Where are the books? So not huge amounts of people read is the first thing to say. Now, the Valyrian freehold did not, it was huge, but it did not extend over into Westeros. So we would not expect and communication and travel were very difficult in those times, so we would not expect there to be lots of Valyrian texts and things in Westeros, as is obviously the case. As for their technical manuals, they seem to have guarded them very closely. So things like Valyrian steel secrets are lost because they didn't want anyone else knowing how to do it, which seems fair. I agree with you. Yes, there could be more just lying around. And it's probably more to do with the fact that we haven't spent so much time in places like Volantis, for example, where you would expect there to be, because there were people of Valyrian descent live in Volantis, and you would expect them to have things that are left over from the time of Valyria. So that is where you would expect it. I say the Citadel will have some things because we know that the Maesters did many visits to Valyria and before the Doom. What were Maesters doing? They were learning. They were getting information. They were gathering things. And there are parts of the library in Old Town that just most people aren't allowed to go to. So most people aren't even allowed to see these things. Why? Because the Maesters don't want people knowing about dragons. They don't want them knowing about those weird magic things that the Valyrians did. They hate magic. They're trying to stop it. So the Maesters will have been hunting down, probably not publicly, but hunting down any Valyrian text, any magical thing, and getting it down to Old Town and getting it hidden away. So that's why in Westeros we don't get much. There will be more, I'm sure, in Essos. Places like Ashai will have lots of, we know there's lots of ancient knowledge in Ashai, so surely there will be stuff there, but no character goes there. In Volantis, the people of the blood of old Valyria tend to live in old Volantis, in that walled area. So we've not been in there yet. Where else might there be? Lys, perhaps, but we've not been there yet. So I'm not as concerned. There is one. It feels like it does work in world. There is one other thing, just to link this back around to what we've been talking about this time. Because we've been talking about the Citadel and the books that are in there, there is a book which is known as The Death of Dragons, which is in the Citadel, that Tyrion thinks about, and lots of people have got this theory that this is the book that the Faceless Men are trying to get their hands on. That book, without trying to get into all of the detail of how that might fit into the plot, it's worth noting that that book also goes by the name of Blood and Fire, which is what George R. R. Martin is proposing to call Fire and Blood Part 2. Is it the same in-world book? It seems unlikely, but it perhaps hints at the fact that we are going to see the death of dragons. Maybe that we are going to learn. I mean, I've said I don't think we're going to learn exactly how the Maesters went about doing it, but maybe that he is hinting at we're going to see this period. Obviously, we're going to see the dragons die, but perhaps we will be able to read between the lines. It's a nod, an in-world nod to something that it may mean nothing, but he will know. He will know that if he's thinking of calling it Blood and Fire, yes, it's quite fun because it's fire and blood backwards, obviously, but also he has named a book in-world Blood and Fire, and that is not a coincidence. Kelly Johnson saying, will the Jon Snow spin-off explore Cthulhu mythos? I have absolutely no idea. I wish I could answer this one. There is no information out there about the Jon Snow spin-off at all. I see no reason why it should, but who knows? This has been pitched. It was made very clear. George R. R. Martin made it very clear. This was pitched to him by Kit Harington himself. He had a team of writers with him, so this isn't. Don't get the impression this is just Kit Harington thinking, I want something which is a star vehicle for me, and here's an idea for you. He has got some professional writers who are writing a story about Jon Snow. George R. R. Martin has talked to them. He has had an input. He has implicitly he's ticked it to say, okay, this isn't going to be terrible, because he said that his job is to make sure that things remain canon. What we don't know is what's written in his contract with HBO. Does he have to agree to everything that they agreed to? We're not sure. But anyway, Cthulhu, where the Cthulhu mythos seems to be strongest in George R. R. Martin's world is not north of the Wall so much. Other than perhaps if you go to the Mountains of Madness, maybe there will be some echoes of that. But I don't see any hints or suggestions of that. Andrew K saying there was some interaction and study between the Citadel and Valyria, but it seems Valyria kept it somewhat at arm's length to keep certain secrets of their tech. Yes, absolutely. By implication, the Citadel got some bits of tech. And the implication is Valyrian steel, nobody knows how to make it, but the way we get the blacksmiths of Qohor are the only ones who know how to manipulate it. And this is why this is such a big thing when Ned Stark's sword Ice gets melted down and remade into two smaller Valyrian steel swords, is that it's very rare to find Tobbo Mott who does this. Probably the only person in Westeros, I think, who can do it. It's very rare to have somebody who can. But the Maesters, very quietly, is never no attention's really drawn to it at all. But one of the links, if you study the higher mysteries, if you study magic, the link in your chain is a Valyrian steel link, which clearly shows that they know how to do it as well. So they have got some bits of information from Valyria. We just do not know what, and they're not sharing it with anyone. Stephanie Frederick saying, Wayne Holland super chat with the message, love your channel, just wanted to thank you. Oh, thank you very much. Did I miss that one? I apologize, Wayne, but thank you very much. Beesman saying, this is replying on the Witcher reading orders. Thank you. Makes sense. I always go for release date order, but here there might be contention. Also, forbid my friend to watch the Netflix series before the 2 short story books. Yeah, so read the 2 short story books first. James Horner. This is the last question from one of my patrons, so now is a good time to drop any other questions you have into the chat. I will try and go through as many of them as I can. James Horner saying, "Hi, Robert. I have a slightly unrelated question. In Fire and Blood, it says that when the Stormlanders surrendered to the Targaryens, King Argalac's daughter was handed over naked and in chains. This seems a little excessive. Do you think this is Targaryen propaganda to make the conquest look more justified, or is it a case of George R. R. Martin turning things up to 11 in the ways that he sometimes does?" I think this is him turning it up to 11 in the way he sometimes does. People being paraded around naked, he uses elsewhere with the Walk of Shame with Cersei, for example. This is something that feels as if it fits in with his world. So no, I don't think this is something to Targaryen propaganda. I think this is it might be, but it very probably did happen. I see no reason why it didn't. Andrew Case saying, "Where do you think Aegon IV's long-held obsession against Dawn came from? He's originally campaigning with Daeron the First there." He did in his early days. He did campaign there. A lot of the Targaryens had a bit of an obsession with Dawn, even all the way through to Aerys II, the Mad King. When he was presented with his grandchild, Elia Martell's child with Rhaegar, he smelt it and said, "Smells Dawnish." This is something that a lot of the Targaryen kings had. I think this just stems from a sort of a cultural memory for them of the fact that Dawn defeated Aegon the Conqueror. And this is, it sounds slightly inconsequential. We probably don't think about it as much as we should, but this was a big blow for them. They thought that they were unstoppable. They took all the rest of the 7 kingdoms, no problem, just rolled them over. Dawn, they couldn't. In fact, Dawn killed one of the original Targaryens and a dragon. There is absolutely no doubt that Dawn won that war, and the Targaryens threw everything at it time and time and time again, and they lost. So this, I think, is it's a matter of pride for the Targaryens, and this is why it keeps on coming up about Dawn, is that they look at a map and they see all of Westeros is ours except that last little bit at the bottom. That, I think it's the more pride that a Targaryen has, the more they get obsessed by Dawn. Question from Reflective Rambling saying, "I missed the super chat." I assume that's the one from Wayne Holland. Thank you very much. Andrew K, I'll just answer that one. Reflective Rambling, tips for doing so much audio work without losing voice. Turning Twitter back on you. Popular Fire and Blood characters, others love you. You Eon. Oh, okay. Sorry. This is how do you, first bit, audio work without losing voice, drink lots of water. Small sips. In terms of the second one, I did. This is a reference, I think, to. I tweeted out earlier today. Which Lord of the Rings character does everyone else seem to love, but you're a bit nah about? Which for me is Thranduil. Never liked the guy. And that got quite an interesting response. A lot of people coming out with characters that everyone else likes, but they don't. Some people dislike Frodo. Some people hate Thorin. There are a lot of characters out there that have huge amounts of fans, but they just great for others. So yeah, I could do that for Fire and Blood. You're right. Maybe I will do some point in the next week or so. Alexandra saying, sorry, off topic. When the Winds of Winter release date is announced, could you do a recap of where each of the characters are in the book and their main plot points? Yeah, so this is one of the things that I've been slowly trying to do with History of Westeros, actually, is these character journeys. I've done one for Tyrion, I've done one for Brienne, which is through their journey so far in A Song of Ice and Fire and where they're at and where they might be going next. But mostly focusing on just getting us set up so we're ready for the Winds of Winter whenever it happens. Do go and check them out. I've got another one coming out soon on Arya. We'll see. They've not been as popular as some of the other ones, so I like them. I think they're really good. But let me know if there's any more like that you'd find useful. Okay, so I think with that, I'm going to start drawing this one to a close. The next week, I'm going to be looking at Duncan Egg. This is another thing George R. Martin said that he's going to be doing a bit more on his many priorities. Duncan Egg, he's specifically said if there's a Duncan Egg TV show happening, then I probably ought to get writing a few more Duncan Egg stories, which is yes, love it. But what's next? What do we know about what will be happening next in Duncan Egg? Because we've got lots of different bits of information over a long period of time. That's next week. A couple of weeks' time, I'll be doing one of my Lord of the Rings streams. I think that's probably all I'm going to say for now. If you are watching this back a bit later, appearing somewhere around here will be a link to other live streams that I've done. Appearing somewhere around here will be a link to my Patreon page. If you wish to support this channel, that's the best way to do it. Okay, everyone, thanks. Some fantastic questions today. Great chat. Take care, everyone. Thank you, moderators. Almost forgot to say it. You are amazing. Thanks, everyone. Take care, and I will see you again next week.